Israel alumni in attendance tonight, so I think some of you who've been to Israel before are going to see, does it look the same as before? And I think we agreed at our table that the ancient ruins look the same. But modern Israel, of course, is always building and expanding and innovating, so that part might look different.
Well, I'm a Larry Norman alumni.
Yeah.
Some of you will recognize, oh, I thought you'd think that was me with my long hair. Oh, no? Okay. Well, this is the official start, is to hear the first verse of this song. You'll get the meaning of it shortly. Sounds kind of Caribbean. It's not really Israeli.
The word is revolution, but no one's fired the shot. Each side has its battle plan, detailed counter thought, and the world is closely watching as we near the battle line. But if you're truly wise, you keep your eyes on Palestine.
So there you go. If you're truly wise, you'll keep your eyes on Palestine. That is the place in the world where some of the most significant conflict has happened, and it's actually promised that there will be more conflict there. Right? The Battle of Armageddon is set on the plains of Megiddo. That was one of the places we went. Going to Israel was on my bucket list, as it was on some of yours, and maybe still is on some of yours. The way the opportunity came up was that Emily, my daughter, started working at a church in Regina called Hillsdale Baptist, and their pastor organizes these trips every so often. And when he saw that she was interested, he said, "Oh, would you like to bring a family member along?" She said, "My dad would love this." And she was so right. So that's how it came to be, and she couldn't be here tonight, but I'm going to share with you some of what we experienced, and I've got it timed out to be less than an hour, even with a lot of questions from you, so I trust it'll be worth your time. Israel is a small country with big importance. The modern nation of Israel has existed only a short time, but the land and the people have a long history. God did things there for us to know about here. And God did things then for us to know about now. And the Bible says in a couple of places about how important that is. 1 Corinthians 10. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written down for our instruction. Or Romans 15. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So my hope is that the things I tell you today will increase your interest in the Bible and increase your faith that Jesus really did come, and that you can do God's will as He did. The way that we kind of advertised tonight was to call it a travelogue and a testimony. I'd say it's only partly a travelogue, which is the pictures of the places and the description of the traveling. Mostly it's a testimony of what I witnessed and how I saw God in those experiences. So the words I've used here are changes of mind and meaningful moments. The way my mind was changed on this trip and meaningful moments with God. And one of the first meaningful moments happened even before we left Canada. Emily and I went to stretch our legs in the Toronto airport. And I mean that literally. We just found an open area of carpet in the corner and sat on the floor to stretch our legs. And a young man approached us and asked if we wanted to pray the mincha with them. Well, it sounded kind of Jewish. And we were on a flight to Israel, so a lot of the people in our waiting area were wearing different Jewish garb. And so I thought, hey, I'd be praying to the same God as they are. God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? So I said, sure. And then we realized that Emily wasn't allowed to join because he was looking for a certain number of men to make up the minimum number. So Emily carried on back to our seats, and I asked, do I need to cover my head? And he said, you don't have a kippah, which is that little skull cap that the Jewish men wear? And I said, no. Is putting my hood up good enough for a goyim like me? That was my mispronounced word for a non-Jew. Yeah, that would be fine, he said. Okay. So, over by the payphones, there were some other men kind of gathering. It looked kind of like a slow-motion flash mob, like all these people coming together. And somehow they chose a leader and started quietly saying prayers, responding to the leader's part with Amen, or some other words in Hebrew, or they would take a couple of steps forward and a couple of steps back, or they would rock at the waist. These are all parts of their way of praying. But I wondered, what am I supposed to do? There's no bulletin to tell me when it's time to say anything or kneel or who knows what. So I wondered if I should ask the guy who invited me. His head covering, by the way, was a Metallica baseball cap. But he was looking on his phone and presumably reading these prayers. Basically, I just stood and faced the same direction as him, wondering kind of what I should do. And then I realized, if I was praying a psalm, then I would be kind of participating. And so God brought Psalm 22 to my mind. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? So, as I'm reading this on my phone, I already know that this is not just a prayer of David in his voice, but also the voice of Jesus from the cross, right? You've heard that before. This is a messianic psalm. This is what Jesus was expressing on the cross. But then it came to me, this is also the voice of Israel as a nation, crying out, surrounded by enemies, feeling abandoned, remembering that God has helped them in the past. And that just really got to me. I started to cry and continued to pray and read. And that psalm continues with praise and the promise that all nations will bow down and worship. Well, here I am. I'm bowing down my head a little deeper now. And then I remembered Psalm 122. I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. This Jew had invited me to worship with them, and I was glad. A little parallel to the scriptures. And that psalm continues with, our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. So it just felt so real and relevant. I'm on my way to Jerusalem. I'm going to be standing in those gates. So I just felt like I was part of God's story. Okay, let's get to Israel. After an overnight flight, we walked into the Ben Gurion airport in Tel Aviv and stood in the lines of hundreds of people to go through the passport control. And right close to me was this fellow who had invited me the day before to pray with them. His name was Sasha. And he and his brother were from Montreal. I asked him what the meaning of the prayers was, so he explained all about that. And then I asked him why he had invited me. And it turned out Emily was right. He had thought I was a Jew. I don't know. Okay, once we started driving around, this is very interesting. I've been looking at different slides here the whole time, but you haven't. You saw that one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, I get it. I'm just learning my system here. Okay, so once we started driving around in Israel, my mind was changed by some surprising things that I saw, like what was growing. So I thought it was just dry and rocky in Israel, but there were lots of trees and shrubs and fields, lots of flowers, fruit, lots of irrigation hoses, Not like big things with sprinklers, but just drip irrigation, lots of pipes, hoses. So I was also surprised as a prairie boy about how up and down everything was, lots of rocky hills. So one of the things I bought here is a 3D map of Israel, so you can kind of see where the mountains are. So I trust you guys, you're not going to try to pop it in. Touch it gently, pass it around. Oh, I don't know. Don't touch it, just kind of.
No, they shouldn't even pass.
Shouldn't even pass it around. Okay. I'll put it on the table in the back and you can look at it with your eyes later. Okay, so these are all the things I was going to pass around, just assuming it was going to be good. So things were bigger in that way, up and down, but they were also smaller. When I went to the Sea of Galilee, it just looked like, what? This is just like a little lake. But then I realized, oh yeah, it stretches way to the south. And maybe the reason it looks so small this way is because the hills on the other side are really quite tall. Anyway, another distance surprise was about being on Mount Carmel. So that's where God's prophet Elijah had a contest with the 450 prophets who worshipped the god Baal or Baal. They built the 2 altars. Whichever god could light the fire to burn up the sacrifice was the real God. After the prophets of Baal tried and failed, Elijah dug a trench around his altar and got his helpers to pour pail after pail of water over the whole thing. You remember that story? So, you'll also remember that it was a time of terrible dryness. And so I always wondered how, after 3 years of no rain, would they have been able to get this water? They must have gone down to the Mediterranean, just down the side of the hill, right? Get the water, bring it back up. Well, can you see the Mediterranean from here? If you think you can, you're just looking at clouds. Like, maybe on a clear day, you can see a little bit of it. But it is way too far away for that thing to have all happened in one day. So I wondered, how is this possible? Our guide said, even though it hadn't rained, there are still springs of water that come up out of the mountain, so they probably got it from that. So that just changed my mind about how that whole scene was supposed to look in the Bible story, you know? Okay, so Nazareth. There's a ministry in the city of Nazareth called Nazareth Village, started by this man, who was an archaeologist. We heard about this place from Brad and Carissa when they were there, but I hadn't been able to picture it very well, and now I got a good picture. So this archaeologist kind of started this place because they were doing some digging, as they do often in Israel. And one of the things they found on this hillside was something in the bedrock that looked man-made. A pit, the size of a big bathtub. So could this be a vat or reservoir for a wine press? If it was for a wine press, then there would have to be an area for treading on the grapes, which, by the way, you have to do barefoot with your soft feet, so the hard soles of your sandals don't crush the bitter seeds. Well, sure enough, this shallow area also has a little trough chiseled out so the juice can run down into the reservoir. Okay, well that's a good start. To save work though, your wine press would have to be at the bottom of the hill, so you don't have to carry the grapes up the hill. So was this hill actually a vineyard? If so, it should have terraces, shelved levels for each row of vines. Well, as they excavated up the hill, they did find evidence of terraces. And at the top, the foundation of a round tower. So the little tower circled in the picture there was built recently on that ancient foundation. Now think about it. Jesus grew up in this town. When he told his parable about the man who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, and dug a pit for the winepress, and built a tower, and leased it to tenants, and went into another country, Jesus was picturing a vineyard. Could he have been thinking about exactly this vineyard? That just blew my mind again. Wow! It just made it seem so real. And one more experience in the Nazareth village was this synagogue replica. It's based on designs from that time in history, so to actually go inside it and get a sense of the space and imagine the scene that happened in the synagogue there when Jesus started his public ministry, that was pretty amazing too. So, these are hills that Jesus saw. Not hills like these, but these actual hills. You might get tired of me saying that, but it's not like it happened everywhere in Israel, where I thought, hey, Jesus saw this or did this. But certain places, it became clear. So the picture on the left of the grassy hill with the shrubs, that is part of a bigger hill that they call the Mount of the Beatitudes, which is probably where what happened? Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount, we presume, was attended by quite a few people. And how is it that maybe a couple thousand people could hear the voice of one guy who has no microphone? Well, apparently that particular hill gets these afternoon breezes that carry the voice of the speaker almost magically across the whole hillside. But we couldn't go to that part of the hill because it's now covered by a banana orchard. And then the picture on the right is the late afternoon. The steep hills on the left are what we now call the Golan Heights. And that's the side of the lake in Jesus' time where he cast the demons out of the man, and the demons went into the herd of pigs. And the pigs ran down the steep bank and drowned. And on the right side of that picture, I don't know if you can quite see it, but that is the city of Tiberias, which was just being built in Jesus' time. So I don't know if he actually saw that. Next morning. In between me taking that afternoon picture and this morning picture, something interesting happened. I went for a jog. Okay, that's not so interesting. But the interesting part to me was who I met on this jog. And it was dark. It was as dark as night, even though we hadn't had supper yet, because it gets dark at 4:30 or 5. And as I jogged out towards the lake, I went out on the jetty, like a rocky pier sticking into the lake, and I saw somebody with a headlamp wading around it among the reeds, and someone else up on the rocks at the end. And I realized they were fishing. One with a net, the other with a pole. And so in the glow of their flashlights, I started a conversation with them. All three young men were Arabic speaking and had learned Hebrew. So far, so bad, right? I can't talk to them. But one of them also spoke the English he learned from watching TV shows. Not very good words. But he was a generous fellow. He was the one who had brought all the bait and the drinks for everyone. So I accepted a strawberry pop from him. My little souvenir. And the third fellow, he also knew some English. And he had wanted to study in Canada to be a doctor. But it was going to be too expensive to get a visa and so on. So he went to the Ukraine. And he learned Ukrainian and Russian. So there was a lot of language options, but really only English was our common one. So I had a good long conversation about how young men ought to behave toward young women, and about God being the final judge who knows everything, and about Jesus working on this lake. Now they didn't really know much about Jesus, although the med student had read the Quran. So I told them about Jesus and his followers who fished here, on the Sea of Galilee. Now, so far, none of these Arabic-speaking guys had caught anything. So I told them about the time the men fished all night and caught nothing. But in the morning, Jesus told them to try again on the other side of the boat. If you say so, said Peter. And then they caught so many fish, their boat started to sink. Go away from me, Jesus, said Peter. I'm not a good enough man to have you near me. Then I told these Arabic fellows, I have an idea. Because Jesus is still alive, And because he might want you to know that, as fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, I want to pray and ask Jesus to help one of you catch the first fish. Who wants to volunteer? So the guy who brought all the bait, he agreed. So I prayed he would catch the first fish, and that he would thank God for it, and then do whatever God showed him next. And I stayed as long as I could to see how the prayer would be answered. But then it was our group's turn for supper, and I had to leave. So I don't know what happened. Somebody caught the first fish. I'm hoping it was him. So that was a meaningful moment for me. So all that happened in the north of Israel, in Galilee. And then, like Jesus, we traveled from Galilee to Jerusalem, which is up to Jerusalem. It gets very hilly and mountainous. So here's a place in the Judean wilderness that you can see both Jerusalem on the highest mountain in that direction, and you can see Jericho, the first city on the plain, in that direction. So that was another great kind of, this is how it looks when we talk about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. It may have looked like this, or certainly the story of the Good Samaritan as he helps the traveler who gets beaten up on his way down from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's pretty easy to see how there would be a lot of hiding places for robbers in this kind of terrain. We didn't travel far, but what kind of animal is this? A camel. Anybody know more specifically which kind of camel it is?
Riding one.
A riding one. That's right. Well, camel is close enough. I don't actually know which of the two types it is. I'm just going to pause here and point out a more general shift of mind that happened. I had to move from those images in my head that I got from Sunday school illustrations to the actual pictures. I had to move from my imagination to what is real. So in some ways that change of mind felt disappointing, because things are not as picturesque or as pretty as I imagined, or they're not as special and spiritual looking. I don't know, is that a thing? But in other ways, this change of mind was good. Things were more gritty and real than the paintings, which helped me appreciate how mundane life was and how everyday-ish it was for the disciples. Like here in this picture, we're walking through the old city of Jerusalem, and kids are on their way to school. Just everyday stuff. So it must have been hard for the disciples to believe that something unique was happening. They could look back later and see what God had been doing, but as it was happening, the realization would have dawned very slowly. Only some people would have been catching on about who Jesus really was. Okay, so on the temple, south side of the Temple Mount, are the oldest of the steps, and it's very likely Jesus saw that wine press in Nazareth, and it's certain that he saw the hills around the Sea of Galilee. But here we can be quite sure that Jesus walked up these steps. So that was another kind of cool moment. So there we are, just to prove that I am there, and so is Emily. You can see it a bit better there.
Where do these steps go?
Well, they used to go up into here. But in all the things that have happened since then, they've boarded up or bricked up different gates and torn down. Like those really big steps right here in the front of the picture, the Romans knocked that all down. Or if it wasn't the Romans, then it would be the Muslims or somebody hundreds of years later. But you can still see the evidence of those steps, which I'll show you in a couple slides. Now, I'm just going to point out the scale of all this. My impression is that those little people in the diagram are actually drawn a little bit too small. But it's still a pretty massive area that the temple was built on. And so you can kind of agree with the disciples when they say, "Wow, Master, look at this. These huge stones. Look at this amazing place." Like, in all the ancient world.
So this was Herod's temple?
Yeah. This is from the time of Jesus. This is how he would have seen it. And that's the poster that's lying on the table back there as well. So, another thing that came up was Jesus walking around in this temple area, and what kind of things did he teach? Well, there was that one when the leaders challenged him about politics and Jewish identity and civil disobedience. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the time when they said, should we go along with the government or resist them? Or what they said more specifically was, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And what did Jesus say next? He got to that, but what did he start with?
Give Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God.
You guys know the punchline. But how did he start? How did his object lesson start?
Show me.
That's right. Bring me a coin. Okay, these are Israeli coins, but they're not from that time. Bring me a denarius, he said. So, this, as far as we can tell, is the kind of denarius he was talking about. And Jesus said, whose image and whose inscription are on it? In other words, whose picture, whose words, whose face is on the money? Caesar's. And that's why he said, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. In other words, provide him what really belongs to him. Give him the money. It's his money. So here's just, again, a bit of perspective. Those two boxed in areas in red are these two areas. So in the picture on the left, where the shrubs are kind of growing out of the side of the wall, 2/3 of the way up, that's where the top of that arched steps used to be. You can see at the very bottom left of that picture, where the white line kind of goes right to it. Those would be the shops that were kind of built into the base of the steps. You know, everywhere you go, there's a good spot for a shop. And that's how they used to do it then. So the way that this verse ends that Jesus was talking about is render unto God the things that are God's. So give to the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and give to God what belongs to God. Give to the emperor what has his face on it, and give to God what has God's face on it. What has God's image on it? We do. People. You do. So give him the money. It's his money. You are like God's money. Give him yourself. You belong to him. You bear his image. Now here's one more angle on money. Money is a message. Currency is communication. What if you woke up after, I don't know, in the movies sometimes you get drugged and you wake up in another country. Okay? Maybe without a kidney. Anyway, that's not funny. How would you be able to know what country you were in? Well, if you found a coin, you would find out the name of the country and who's in charge. So, we're in Canada. A polar bear is in charge. No. The Queen is in charge. So in ancient times, when there was a new ruler, how would people find out? New coin. So money gives you the news. Not the hourly news like we're used to in this time of pandemic, but it tells you how things are, the reality, the status quo. And so these coins are from about 40 years after the time of Jesus, because as near as we can figure, he died and rose again in about the year 33. And it was in the year 70 that the Romans destroyed the temple and took over the country. So to celebrate and communicate that fact, the Roman Emperor Vespasian created this coin that says, Judea capta. Judea has been captured. So once again, archaeology confirms historical writings. Dig down and you'll find the Bible is true. Now, look at the western wall. That little red square is where street level is today. And that's another old interesting story about how Herod did things and then how subsequent conquerors built things up and whatnot. But that little spot on the western wall is significant because it's where Jews can get the closest to where? That's the closest they can get to the Holy of Holies. That's the closest they can get to where the temple was. See in the top left corner? That is the temple. But that is not there anymore. That got knocked down. And the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock over that spot. So, for Jews, it is what they might consider the most holy place they can get to is right here at the Western Wall. So that's why it's a very emotional place to be. So that's me waiting my turn to pray there as well.
Is that also called the Wailing Wall?
Yeah, because so many people are crying as they pray. Yeah. And by the way, when I was done my prayer time there, which actually didn't feel very special at all, I'll just say, I turned away from the wall and someone seemed to be waiting to see me. And he kind of looked familiar, and his name was Shane. And he is Sasha's brother. So we chatted about the trip so far, and then Sasha came over and gave me a big hug. Again, I'm not quite sure what it all meant, but it was good. Skull Hill. Most of the pictures we see of Jesus' crucifixion show 3 crosses on the top of a hill. The Gospels name the place Golgotha, or Golgotha, which is the place of the skull. And lots of research has gone into where this actual place could be. And there are 2 major options. The one we went to see seems to fit the description and the history. First of all, it was outside the city walls at that time. Secondly, the limestone hill has natural cracks and caves that look a little like a skull face with large eye sockets. Can you see that? Well, that's 120 years ago that somebody took that picture. These pictures focus on a slightly different angle, and they may look even more like 2 eye sockets. And nose. This is the picture I took, the one with the circle there. And I can't really see it. I mean, it may depend more on the time of day and the viewing angles and the shadows and whatnot. And of course, things have changed in 2,000 years with erosion. But our minds have a pretty strong ability to find a face in things. Like, I mean, you look at any car these days and you go, wow, that car looks mad. You know, like, it's just a psychological thing we can do is to find the face.
The driver.
What's that?
The driver that's mad.
Driver that's mad, yeah. So, perhaps there's, some imagination, but it was, anyway, the thing that people called it back in that time was Skull Hill. And the third reason why they might think that this is the real place that Jesus was crucified is that it was also near a main road which was close to a gate in the city. And today it's part of a bus depot, as you can see there. The Romans made crucifixions as public as possible, because if you're the government and you're advertising what happens to people who rebel against the government, you place your message where people can see it, like a billboard beside the highway. Now, of course, people could see a cross if it was on top of a hill, but then they wouldn't be able to read the sign. Remember, Governor Pilate had a message written above Jesus' head in the 3 main languages of Jerusalem? What did it say?
This is Jesus, the King of the Jews?
Close. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Yeah. So it's most likely the crosses were not up on the top of the hill, but at the bottom of the hill, close to the road, so people could see and read as they passed by. Okay, so now I'm sorry, I'm just messing up all of your Sunday school pictures of how the cross looks, right? Fourthly, there would have to be a garden nearby, according to the Gospels. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I've imagined the Garden of Gethsemane to be like a park. But it was actually an olive grove. In other words, a garden is a garden. It's a place to grow things to eat. It's agricultural, like an orchard. So, when an ancient wine press was unearthed at this site, it showed that this garden was a vineyard. Or you could say this vineyard was a garden. Fifth, there had to be a tomb cut out of the rock. Well, in 1867, or thereabouts, a tomb like that was unearthed at this site. And when I say unearthed, you may wonder how things get covered up. I'll just give you a couple of little examples. We went to a place called Bet Shean, where, let's say, 50 years ago, someone noticed a piece of marble sticking out of the ground, and they started to dig around it, only to discover it was the top of a pillar. So they kept digging and found more pillars, and eventually a whole street, and then a whole Roman town, complete with shops along the main paved street, kind of like a mall, and the fountains and public bathrooms and temples at one end of the street, and then at the other end of the street, a theater, where, by the way, we sang on the stage, and the people way up there in the stands could hear us perfectly well. Now, how did this get covered up? Like, did the Romans say, I guess we're done here. Bring in the front-end loaders. Let's put the dirt on. No, not at all. It just happens naturally. Like when you build a sidewalk, and by the end of the first summer, there's a bit of dirt that's just drifted in on the edges. A little bit of grass grows in there. A bit more drifts in. And give that 20 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, and it's just dirt and sod all the way up. So you have no need for heavy equipment. It just gets buried. And so this tomb was unearthed, and it matches the descriptions of being set up for a stone to roll across the door, because there's a groove kind of in front of the door. It also has a door small enough that adults have to bend over to look inside. These are all clues in the gospel, right? And there has to be a resting place inside the tomb that is visible from the door. So far, so good. So that's what it looks like inside. It doesn't really look like much, does it? I'll explain a couple things. But first, the significance. In a sense, this place is at the center of the Christian faith. Because the most important thing about the most important person happened here. That Jesus was raised from the dead. But in another sense, this place is not as important as the fact that Jesus is alive and that he's coming back. And you kind of have to take that thing about place with a grain of salt, because it's not 100% that it happened here. It could have been at the other place they think it might have been. The other place is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And yeah, those of you who've been to Israel, you've experienced this. Nowadays, when we think, we got to preserve this, like a nature preserve, we build a fence around it and then leave it as natural as possible, right? Don't touch it. But back in the day, if they thought, wow, this is the place where it happened, let's protect it. Let's build a church around it. And let's just put a little hole in the floor where people can reach down and touch the rock where Jesus was born, where Jesus was buried, or whatever. And I go, that's just so unnatural. Like, you just can't get a sense of what it looked like back then. Yes, but we preserved it. So there are kind of two different ways of preserving things, right? So this picture is kind of a mix of those things, because they did try to preserve it in the sense of like plastering the walls, and we also kind of marked it a little further up, just out of the frame of the picture. There's like a special cross painted on the wall. You know, obviously that wasn't there when Jesus was using the tomb. So it's kind of you have to go in and somewhat use your imagination or your faith. But again, the point is putting the evidence together and believing the witness of the real people who were there, wherever there it was, and the people who wrote it down. So, a little bit of detail here about the inside of that tomb. That groove for the stone to roll across the front, that has been modified over the years, so you kind of wonder, how did it look originally? Also, the door opening, which you saw in that previous picture, like it has bricks beside it. That's obviously not the way they originally dug it out. You know, so I guess it got broken and fixed. The other little hole that you see up and to the right from the door, that's a ventilation hole, which kind of relates to how Jewish burial practices go. They allow for some ventilation, I guess. And then the part that you're actually looking at there that looks like kind of looks like a coffin, you might say, size of a bathtub or whatever. That isn't how it looked back then either. And that's because the slabs are missing. So the way it's set up is it's a 2-room tomb. Some of you know all this, but for those who don't, I think you'll find it interesting, because I sure did. Straight ahead when you step into the tomb, there was a stone bench or a shelf for preparing the body with spices and wrapping it in cloth. The second room to the right is what you see in this picture, and the doorway wall is just that one on the left there. In the center of this picture you see what looks like a coffin, but it used to have a slab or slabs of stone on top of it, so the body wouldn't lie down on the floor in that space, but rather it would be up kind of at knee level or so, which would be easier for the people who are trying to carry the body in there. And then on the right side of the picture you see another little bench, which was for another smaller body. And then off to the right side of the picture, which you can't see, was another slab. In other words, the first room was for getting things ready, and the second room was for the bodies to rest. Now, I used to joke that Jesus' grave could have had a sign on it saying, temporary occupancy only, or only renting for 2 nights. But now I've realized that Jewish burial in a tomb was fairly temporary for everyone, because after a year or so in that climate, it's only bones left, and then they gathered up those bones and put them in a bone box, and that could be taken and stored in your home. Kind of like with cremation, you know, people take the urn home. And so then the tomb would be used by somebody else, because it's, you know, not an easy thing to dig out of limestone, so they reuse them. So that's a bit of detail about Jesus' tomb as far as we can tell. But again, the key thing is the tomb is empty, Jesus is alive, and he is coming back. So, your turn. What questions do you have before I share my 3-minute conclusion?
Did you get to go down the Via Dolorosa?
We did see part of the Via Dolorosa. It was not part of our tour or experience so much, although our pastor pointed out a number of times that we weren't there as pilgrims the way some people are. So, you know, on one hand, we want to respect the spirituality of other Christian traditions, but on the other hand, we want to be a little suspicious or careful about
anything that turns into idol worship. And sometimes it just seemed like, wow, those people are just like kissing the rock and just crying over it. And you don't really know what kind of spiritual experience they're having, but you don't have to do that in order to be close to God, right? In fact, our pastor sometimes says, you do not have to go to Israel to have an experience with God. When you go to church and when you have your devotions, that's when you connect with God. This might help you understand the Bible better and so on, but you don't have to go to Israel to meet God. Somebody else.
Did you have a local person there to take you on the tours too?
Yeah, he called himself a secular Jew. But I told some of you at FOSPA time that he had studied a lot, partly for his training as a tour guide, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so he often tried to make the theological connections for us about what this meant for Christians. But then sometimes our pastor was kind of like, so he'd say, oh, Pastor Bill, you tell us, what do you think? And then we'd hear another angle on it. Yes, we did. It wasn't, I don't know what they used to look like or what some of them look like, but this was just a very nice hotel on the Sea of Galilee, but it was run by a kibbutz. Yeah. Kibbutz being kind of like a cooperative, communal living, sharing the work and the money. Not quite like a Hutterite colony, like that would be a bit more extreme, communal living, but the kibbutz system, I think, started in the 1930s. And it was one of the ways that they kind of resettled Israel. There are also cooperative farms there. That's another whole system. But then most Jews live in villages or towns, but there is kind of an expectation, even for secular Jews, to live in somewhat of a community. Like, it's not very often that the farmer will live all by himself on the farmyard. There will be a farmyard for equipment and whatnot, but they don't live there. They live in the village so they can be with each other. Yeah.
Did you encounter any of the places where Jews are being brought back from Ukraine and Russia and resettled there?
No, we didn't see any of that. But I know that's happening, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned the Dead Sea, but did you get to see the Dead Sea?
We did. It's as dead as ever. Apparently, it's just getting murkier and thicker as it evaporates and not much new water comes in. Yeah. Yeah, the fun part, I don't know, some of you have been in the Red Sea, so you know how easy it is to float. So the challenge for some of us was, would we be able to do like when you're in a pool, you can kind of like tread water and just, kind of like in a standing position. That's very hard to do. Your feet just want to come up, whoop, whoop. So you just have to like really paddle to stay straight. Yeah, it's kind of funny.
Did you go out to Masada?
Masada, yes. The palace and fortress of King Herod. I don't know if he actually used it, but he had it built. And that's another whole story, isn't it? The last stand of the Jewish rebels against the Romans happened there.
What about shepherds in the field? Did you see any?
We didn't go to Bethlehem, partly because of the complication with it being Palestinian territory. But when we were at, I guess, the southeast edge of Jerusalem, we looked over and we saw Bethlehem. So that was another bit of a mind shift. Hey, like, what? You can see Bethlehem from Jerusalem? It's that close? Well, both those cities have expanded since the time of Jesus, so I don't know if you could see it at the time of Jesus or not, but now you can. But we didn't see the fields, no. These are some of your favorite places, I'm guessing. Okay.
Did you see the cave where some of the scrolls were found?
Yes, Qumran.
Did you go, I think, is it in Jerusalem where they have this building that is sort of the shape of those,
Shrine of the Book.
Shrine of the Book.
Yeah, yeah. And what they have in there is the very oldest scroll that they've ever found of the book of Isaiah. So that's a sobering thing. Actually, another sobering thing which we could talk for a long time about, but I won't, is the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem. Yep. Yeah, if I wanted to choose meaningful moments by how many tears were shed, then really I should have been talking about Yad Vashem the whole time, but I left it out so I wouldn't just cry the whole time. Yeah. All right, one more question or comment. All right. My timer says that I'm at 50 minutes here, so here's my 3-minute conclusion. Heaven and earth came together in Jesus. He came down and lived in the place we call Israel. He came and became human, took on a physical body, became a Jew, and he was the only one on earth who was both divine and human. The only one on earth who was both human and divine. And he said things like this: "The kingdom of heaven is near. Repent and believe the good news." He taught his disciples to pray, "May your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." He lived in Israel, he died in Israel, and then he was raised in Israel and left for heaven from Israel in his resurrected physical body. He could have just disappeared and his spirit floated back to the Father. But God seemed to think it was important for his disciples to watch Jesus rise up in his physical resurrected body into the air. So now Jesus is the only one in heaven who is both human and divine. Where exactly the spirits of the dead are, we don't know. Maybe we'd call it heaven or in the presence of Jesus. But we do know that they don't yet have the bodies that they've been promised because we're waiting for our resurrected bodies. So Jesus is the only one in heaven who is both human and divine. Now all that happened in Israel. But like I said before, you don't have to go to Israel to meet Jesus. He has come to you. By his Spirit, we can know him and sense him with us. And by the power of that Spirit, we can still do the things that he called his first disciples to do. Repent, believe, and then live out the Lord's Prayer. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Heaven and earth will come together in Jesus. How that will happen is a mystery to me, but Ephesians 1 says God's plan for the fullness of time is to unite all things in Christ, things in heaven and things on earth. We know from John 14 that Jesus is preparing a place for us. We know from Revelation 21 there will be a new heaven and a new earth. The new Jerusalem will come down out of heaven to earth. God will dwell among us. Somehow heaven and earth come together in Jesus. Jesus left an important job for us, to testify and make his presence a reality in the present. I'm inspired by these Jewish followers of Jesus, Messianic Jews, who sing worship songs in Hebrew, a sign of good things to come. We got to worship in this church in Jerusalem, and that was pretty encouraging. And so as we go from here, let these sounds ring in your soul until Jesus returns and brings heaven and earth together.
הללו את שם אדוני, יהי שם אדוני מבורך מעתה ועד עולם. השמיים כבודו, מכאדוני אלוהינו, המגדיל לשבת, המשפילי לראות, בשמיים ובארץ, מכאדוני אלוהינו. הללו, עבדי אדוני, הללו, את שם אדוני.